In this video, we will be talking about the release of information, or ROI, and the different ways that we can gain consent from our clients in order to share their data. We should think of the ROI as an opportunity to provide the client with information about privacy, confidentiality, and security, so that they are providing informed consent. It's also an opportunity to empower the client to make a decision regarding how they would like their information shared in HMIS, or even if they want to share it. To be clear, the ROI needs to be completed with the client prior to any instance in which you collect data. Without the ROI on file, you should not even begin the intake process with the client. The time dedicated to thoroughly reviewing the ROI with the client should also be used to answer any lingering questions the client may have about their rights and how their data might be used. There are two ways that we can collect consent from our clients for the ROI. The first is the most desirable way to gain consent, and that's written consent. If the client is able to, have them physically sign a paper copy of the ROI for your files after reviewing all of the information with them. If you are not able to get written consent from your client, meaning they are not able to physically present at your office or agency to physically sign the ROI, you can have this conversation over the phone or verbally with your client. This is not as desirable as getting that written consent from the client, but there will be situations in which written consent is not possible, and that's okay. The COVID-19 pandemic is a great example of this situation. With the pandemic, we might have to pivot from our normal consent collection process because we might not be able to get written consent as often as we used to. So I'd like to spend a little time discussing the verbal consent process and what that looks like. One thing to note, if you cannot gain written consent for whatever reason at the time of intake, you can collect verbal consent. But if the client is able to eventually sign the ROI further down the road, we should still seek to gain that written consent once you're able to. These are the appropriate measures you need to follow to collect verbal consent from your clients. We must get verbal consent from each individual over the age of 18. We must give each client context about what the ROI is and what we're collecting it for. Then we must read the entire ROI to our client. We need to make sure that they understand what it is that they're consenting to. We must ensure that they answer any questions on the ROI, and we're going to take a look at what these questions are in just a moment. You should also read our privacy notice word for word. We're going to dive into the privacy notice in just a moment as well. We should ask each client if they have access to an email account, and if so, we should offer to email them a copy of the ROI, our privacy notice, and our privacy policy for their records. And before moving on, we need to ensure that the client doesn't have any questions about the ROI. Again, it's important that the client knows what their rights are and what's happening with the data that we're collecting from them. Now, let's take a look at these documents. To get there, we're going to head to thn.org. Once you've made it, we are going to head to the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care submenu. We're going to scroll down to the HMIS section, and then we're going to click on HMIS Start Kit. You'll see that we have a number of important documents related to the ROI on this page. We have the ROI in both English and Spanish, which you can download or print. We also have the HMIS Privacy Policy, and we have the HMIS Privacy Notice in both English and Spanish. The HMIS Privacy Policy is quite lengthy, so this isn't something that we expect you to read over the phone with each of your clients while collecting their verbal consent, but it is a document that you should read through and familiarize yourself with. The HMIS Privacy Notice, however, is one of the two documents that you should be reading word for word with your client. Thankfully, it's only one page long, so it shouldn't take too long. And of course, we have to read through the client release of information with the client as well. If you've done intakes before, then you're very familiar with the ROI. However, we recently made some changes to the third page of the ROI, which is the verbal consent page. You'll see that now the verbal consent box asks, does the participant consent to share their information with other agencies in HMIS? Does the participant consent to share their children's information, 17 and younger, with other agencies in HMIS? And if you've gained verbal consent from your client for either of these options, there is a space for you to sign your name at the bottom. There's also a reminder at the bottom that, if possible, we should try and obtain a signed copy from the client if they are ever able to physically present for services. Once you're all done reading both the privacy notice and the ROI with the client, and you've answered all of their questions, you can now move on to the HMIS intake process.
We're going to take a look at how all of this translates into HMIS. Depending on how the client answers the ROI, you as the user might need to make certain adjustments to the client security settings. The basic client information page is one of the places where you are going to find the security restrictions for your client. This page is one of the first screens you see during an intake. Notice that when we scroll to the bottom, the default is automatically set to share globally. Let's say that this client gave verbal consent to share their information in HMIS, and you, as the case manager, have signed the ROI in their stead with your own signature. You can then leave the security restriction default at Share Intake Globally. This means that the client's information can be seen by other agencies using Texas Balance of State COC's HMIS. What if your client responds that they do not wish to share their information in HMIS? If this is the case, then you must manually change the security setting to Restrict to Organization. This means that the client's data is only seen by HMIS users of your organization. No other organization using our HMIS would be able to find the client. On the paper ROI, you would check the box indicating that they do not wish to share their information and leave the verbal consent signature line blank. Let's take a look at the Family Members page now. This page lines up with the second question in the verbal consent section of the ROI. If the client indicates they are willing to share their children's information, leave the security restriction defaults at Share Intake Globally. If the head of household indicates that they do not want their children's data shared, then you must scroll to the far right of the page and change the security setting for each child to Restrict to Organization. Again, in this case, you would check the box on the paper ROI indicating that the client does not want their children's data shared. These security restrictions can be changed and updated as needed. If a client security status needs to be changed, you can do so by clicking on the Edit Client menu option under the Client Profile menu, and then scroll to the bottom of the basic client information page. If the security restrictions for children or other family members need to be changed, you can click on the Family Members menu option, and again scroll to the far right of the page, and you'll be able to change the restrictions there.